I've been pretty keen to talk about this Fujifilm 35mm f1.4 for quite a while because it's just an absolute ripper, isn't it? It is pretty long in the tooth, but God, how nice does it look sitting on a camera with this hood? And when you take the hood off, it's tiny. Now, is it a perfect lens? No, but this one's really good, and the image quality you get out of this size package, and God, how nice it looks. Boy, is it something else. First, to touch on the build quality. Overall, it's pretty good. Not going to say it's the best, but it's pretty good. It's got the older style aperture ring where it's a lot looser, closer to your kit lens, 18 to 55, 2.8 to f4. The focus ring, not the smoothest thing in the world, and it's got a fair bit of resistance, but I don't really like to manual focus on Fujifilm anyway because the responsiveness is just kind of trash. But overall, the build quality is pretty good. The hood is really nice made of metal, really easy to get on and off. And the only other thing about the build quality really is how much the lens itself extends and retracts during focusing, which is quite a lot. And when you factor that in, it is also very noisy. So this is, I don't know what's going on here. So part of the beautiful charm of this lens is that the hood really brings the beautiful retro design aesthetic that you pair with the XT line of bodies together. Just having this squared off design is just a really nice design choice overall, and packaging it with the lens, another great choice. But that does mean that there is a little bit of a drawback because having the hood like this and it being fairly narrow, but it can make it really difficult to put the lens cap in because it's just really fiddly and it's quite tight to the filter thread itself. Fuji did think about that and they provided a rubber cap that goes on top of it, but it doesn't stay on very well. Anytime I put it inside and outside of a bag, it tends to knock off. It comes off fairly easily, too easily for me to actually use it. I oftentimes just find myself not using the lens cap or the hood cover at all and just trusting that the hood is long enough to protect the lens front element itself, and it's worked out fairly well that way. God, I'm not used to wearing jumper and pants in February. It's 13 degrees. It's supposed to be summer here. Is this a sharp lens? I would say absolutely. I've never noticed any softness in my image, especially even at f1.4. Portraits, taking photos of pets, all been tack sharp as much as I'd ever want. So what is the drawback for a fast lens that looks nice metal build quality, and is extremely compact to cover an APS-C sensor? The autofocus is pretty dodgy. How dodgy is the autofocus? It's not too bad really, but it's just really not very good. Don't even try to use this lens in continuous autofocus mode on your camera because it's just going to do that pulsing in and out thing like you saw before. It's just not going to work. Single point focus, it's actually pretty good if you're doing things that move slowly or landscape. It's pretty suitable actually. Doing any sort of portrait photography where someone's standing fairly still and not moving much, it's going to be fine. But if you're doing any sort of candid work where reaction speed to being able to get the camera up and focus and get the shot off before they change their emotion or reaction or to whatever's going on around them, that's when you're going to encounter some problems where the lens is going to be either front or back focused by about 1 meter and it's going to be completely out of focus. That's been where things have slightly annoyed me sometimes because the lens is so small and easy to take around and you can get some really banger photos of people. But when you really want to get those candid moments instead of pose photos, which I'm not always that into getting pose photography, that's when it slows you down and you miss focus and you just miss the moment and it just eats away at you just a little bit. Otherwise, I've been using this all morning for taking photos of all kinds of different things. Found some cool spider webs and got some nice, beautiful morning light, and autofocus has been mostly perfectly fine. So if you're not going to be shooting any fast moving action, you're not requiring and blazing autofocus, it's probably going to do just fine for you. The only other downside to the autofocus besides that though is if you try to use this at night, it is very difficult to use this in a dark scene. Combine it with Fuji's admittedly fairly poor autofocus performance in low light and you pair it with this lens that is not very confident at finding a subject, it's going to do a lot of pulsing. And if you accidentally leave your camera in continuous autofocus while trying to do that, then you're going to have people just standing there waiting for up to 5, 6, 7 seconds before the camera gets focused so you can shoot. Even if you then do chuck it in autofocus single, it's still going to be a little bit unconfident, but you will eventually get there. I used this at a family friend's wedding, and I didn't necessarily trust shooting it at f1.4, f2, and the camera was being passed around, everyone was having a good time using it and shooting this lens. So alternatively, I just chucked a flash on and set it to f5.6 and got some great shots. Shooting it at f5.6, even then, there was still quite a few out of focus shots, like a noticeable amount. A lot less so than they would be at f1.4, but still noticeable and worth mentioning. Now, while I did say the image quality and the sharpness on this lens was really good, and I stand by that, but there are a fair number of situations where there are some pretty negative aspects of the image quality depending on how you look at it. Let's jump into Lightroom. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a more extreme example here, and right off the bat you're probably going to notice a severe amount of color fringing. So this was shot wide open, as you can see. This lens does tend to exhibit quite a bit of color fringing in terms of Loca. Shutter speed is quite high. It does look a little bit smudgy. You can see that the bokeh has some of these green highlights from the color fringing as well. I'll show the raw. This is a pretty extreme example because it is very heavily backlit. I think it's even a little bit more prevalent in this image, and you can see a bit of a lens flare. Don't actually mind that. It hasn't washed out the image frame too much. This is another example of a lens flare. Probably not as nice in this one. It's a bit more of a rainbow effect and causes a little bit more of a loss of contrast. All of these photos were taken with the lens having the hood on. You have some artifacting, ghosting present here as well. Now going to a different image, still fairly backlit. You can see that color fringing. And this is almost even basically chroma smearing at this point. There's some, I think that might be a spider there, and big the actual. Then you can see all of the, but it does highlight how sharp the lens is. It's got a really nice amount of detail on the spider web throughout. It's just that the Loca really is very noticeable the more you punch in, and you don't even have to punch in on this scenario. And this is just the same example at f2.8, so you can still see that largely looks basically the same. Now this is a more controlled example. Here you can see a little bit of that green out of focus Loca, but that's really only noticeable when you punch into 200%. Otherwise, it's not a big concern, especially in this scenario. This is a bit of a continuation on, but also a bit of a highlight on what the bokeh looks like as you stop down as well. So this is at f1.4. You can still see some of that color fringing on the bokeh. You've got some of the green outlining from the color fringing. You've got some of the red highlights here as well, but not too bad overall. This is the example of the close focusing image. It's not awful, but it does look a little bit softer, quite glowy. You're getting quite a bit of color fringing around the small details here, the lettering, So this is another controlled situation of looking at the Loca. So here in the out of focus foreground, you can see some of that red fringing at f1.4, and then you can see the green as it's leaving the focus plane of field. But this is just a photo of a dog at f1.4. I can't notice any sort of color fringing whatsoever. There's a lot of situations where you'll shoot people or animals or other objects and you won't notice any of those chromatic aberrations shooting wide open. So far, most of the color fringing has been most noticeable when either up close and or combined with a bright highlight within the image. In this case, it's a pretty controlled image. And you can see that when punched in, there is purple color fringing on the contrasting edges of the sign. But I think that's enough of the downsides. Probably time to get back to talking about how amazing this lens is. I've taken some of my absolute favorite photos on this lens, and I've basically always had it with me because it is so small. You can just put it in your bag, forget about it. The build quality is nice, but it's still really light. This might not be the most reliable and foolproof primary lens to have with you, but as a backup lens, it's incredible. Because you get the beautiful shallow depth of field at the 50mm f1.4 equivalent, and it just takes great photos. I'm going to try to put as many examples of shooting at f1.4 in this as possible, just to really convey exactly what sort of images you get out of here at f1.4. Because the 35 1.4 part of this, that's the real differentiating factor in getting the other 35s that Fuji offer. The differentiating factor from those other 35mm lenses that Fuji offers is the f1.4, and boy does it stand out. The amount of depth of field separation you're able to get from your subject and the background is just, it's physics, it's great, but it's what the out of focus areas look like that really make this lens something special to use. They just look lovely and creamy and soft and just not distracting at all. I'm going to put a bunch of sample images shooting at different f-stops for this lens to see what exact sort of separation you can get at f1.4 to f4. But it's safe to say I've always loved the portraits and just shallow depth of field shots I've taken with this lens. For the same reason that focusing this lens in stills is a little bit dicey, it becomes kind of extra dicey when trying to use it in video. Well, you can get some really nice video footage with this and get really shallow depth of field of people or objects or things. It works a lot better if the focus doesn't have to change a whole lot because the motor is a little bit jagged. It's not a very modern motor, and that's why the lens is still so small. So you can forgive it for that, but it's also why it makes it not that great for video. And on top of that, it's very loud. The motors are very loud. If you're not using a lavalier type microphone, most microphones on your camera are going to pick this up, guaranteed. Really, the thing that's left this lens off my camera the most probably is the fact that it's not weather sealed. These days, so many lenses are becoming weather resistant that you don't have to worry taking your gear out in the rain. And I've gone on a couple of bigger holidays and a bunch of times I was worried about rain and I just couldn't put this lens in my bag or on my camera, and that was the main reason why I haven't used it as much as I maybe would have wanted to. Which is where those other Fuji 35mm options might come into play, because at least one of them definitely is weather sealed. With the way that this is designed and constructed, I would be terrified of taking this out in any sort of dusty or rainy conditions. This lens has been around for so long and this Fuji's still selling it new, so you can get some absolutely great deals on this. $500 or $600 for a lens of this caliber and so small and compact, and not to mention pretty dang beautiful. I'd recommend this lens to basically almost anyone, unless you live in like the UK maybe, where it rains basically every day of the year. Yeah, absolutely incredible lens. There's a reason that people talk about it so highly, and can't refute any of those points.